What did it truly mean to capture winter itself? To take the bitter cold of January, the frozen stillness of a pond at dawn, and hold it somehow beneath the earth until July, when the sun blazed and gardens overflowed with roses. In the great estates of Georgian England, where wealth built mansions and privilege demanded impossible comforts, there existed a quiet trade that most people have entirely forgotten: the harvesting of ice. Tonight we drift into that world where laborers woke in darkness, where breath turned to frost the moment it left the body, where men with raw hands and aching backs cut blocks of frozen water from silent ponds and carried them deep underground, packing them in straw, sealing them in brick-lined chambers, preserving the cold for months so that somewhere far in the future, on a warm summer evening, a lord or lady might taste a frozen syllabub and marvel at the delightful chill. Before we step into this quiet journey through the frost and labor of England's ice houses, I would appreciate a small gesture. Press the like button and subscribe to this channel, so these late-night passages into forgotten corners of the past will always find you. Leave a comment sharing where you are right now, what time shows on your clock, whether you are wrapped in the deep silence of midnight or just beginning your morning somewhere far away. Now let the light soften around you. Perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that steady, calming hum, and let us settle into tonight's quiet exploration of how ordinary people performed extraordinary work that history barely remembers. Wake in darkness so complete that for a moment you cannot tell whether your eyes are open or closed. The cold finds you immediately, pressing against your face like something alive, something hungry. Your small cottage holds whatever warmth the banked fire managed to preserve through the night. But that warmth is thin and fragile, barely enough to keep the water bucket from freezing solid by the hearth. You lie still for a moment beneath rough woolen blankets, feeling the weight of them, feeling your own reluctance to leave this meager comfort for what waits outside. But you know what day this is. You have been watching the pond for weeks, waiting, and yesterday the word came down from the estate. The ice is ready. The harvest begins at dawn. You rise in the darkness because there is no choice, because this work pays coin when little else does in the lean months of winter, because your family needs what you can earn more than your body needs rest. Your clothes wait where you left them, draped near the dying fire in hopes they might hold some residual warmth. They do not. The wool of your shirt feels stiff and hostile against your skin. Your breeches are cold enough to make you gasp as you pull them on. The boots are the worst, leather gone hard in the chill, resisting your feet as though they too would rather stay by the fire. You stamp and flex, trying to work some life into them, knowing that within an hour of standing on the ice they will be wet through anyway. And wet boots in January are a misery beyond easy description. Your wife stirs but does not rise. There is nothing she can do for you at this hour, no meal she can prepare that would make the day ahead easier. You ate last night a simple supper of bread and cheese and a little salted meat, and that will have to carry you until evening. Some of the men will bring provisions to the pond, hunks of bread stuffed in pockets, perhaps a flask of something warming if they are lucky. You have only water, and even that will turn to ice if left too long in the open air. You touch your wife's shoulder through the blankets, a gesture so familiar it requires no words. And then you step out into the January morning. The stars are still visible overhead, sharp and brilliant in the frozen air. And your breath rises in great plumes that catch what little light exists and seem almost solid, almost tangible, before dissipating into the darkness. The ground beneath your boots is iron hard, frozen so deep that it feels less like earth and more like stone. You can hear it in a strange way, hear the silence that extreme cold creates, the absence of running water and rustling leaves, and all the small sounds that gentler seasons provide. Winter in England is quiet in ways that summer never is. And this morning that quiet feels immense, pressing down from the stars, rising up from the frozen ground, surrounding you completely. You are not alone on the dark path. Other figures emerge from other cottages, other men who have been watching the same pond, waiting for the same word. You fall into step together without much conversation. Words feel too costly in this cold, requiring breath that you would rather save, requiring energy that the day ahead will demand in full. There is Thomas, who has done this work for 20 years and whose hands are permanently marked by it, the joints swollen and stiff, the fingers curving slightly inward as though still gripping invisible tongs. There is young Samuel, only 15, doing his first ice harvest, his face a mixture of eagerness and barely concealed fear. There is old Nathaniel, who should not be doing this work anymore, but who has no sons to provide for him and no choice but to continue until his body finally refuses. Together you walk through the darkness toward the pond that lies on the eastern edge of the great estate. The manor house is invisible from here, hidden beyond rolls of parkland and stands of ancient oak, but you know it exists. Know it intimately in the way that all workers know the houses of those who employ them. You have never been inside, of course. Men like you enter through service doors, if they enter at all, and the ice harvest requires no entrance whatsoever. Your world is the pond, the ice house, the brutal distance between them. The family who lives in that great house, who will eventually consume what you harvest today, might as well live on the moon for all the connection you have to their daily existence. The pond appears first as an absence, a flat darkness where the land should rise and fall. And then, as you draw closer, you begin to see it properly. The ice gleams faintly under the stars, a pale expanse that stretches perhaps 200 feet across, ringed by dormant willows and brown rushes frozen in place. It is beautiful, you suppose, in the way that dangerous things are often beautiful. You have heard stories of men who fell through ice that looked solid, who vanished into black water and were not found until spring. You have heard of men whose wet clothes froze to their bodies, who lost fingers and toes, who coughed through the rest of their shortened lives with lungs damaged by the cold. The ice is beautiful, yes, but you do not trust it, will never trust it. Even as you prepare to walk out onto its surface and spend the day cutting it into blocks, the foreman is already there. A man named Harding, who works for the estate year-round, and who oversees the ice harvest with the seriousness of a general commanding troops. He has torches burning in iron brackets, their light flickering across the ice and casting strange shadows that move and dance. The tools are laid out on the bank, waiting. Long poles with iron tips for testing the ice and guiding cut blocks. heavy saws with teeth designed to bite through frozen water, wooden sledges for hauling the harvest to the ice house, tongs that look like the jaws of some primitive beast designed to grip blocks weighing 100 pounds or more. You have used all of these tools before, know the weight of them, know how they will feel in your hands after an hour of work, after 6 hours, after a full day that stretches from this darkness to the darkness that will come again this evening. Harding counts heads, nods in satisfaction, speaks briefly about the day's expectations. The ice is 5 inches thick at the center, he says, perhaps 6 inches near the banks where the water is shallower. Good ice, clear ice, the kind that will keep well if packed properly. He expects 40 cartloads by nightfall. The number sounds impossible, sounds like a demand designed to break men rather than employ them. But you say nothing because there is nothing to say. The work is what it is. You will do it until it is done, or until your body fails, whichever comes first. The eastern sky has begun to lighten almost imperceptibly, the stars fading one by one, the darkness softening toward gray. Soon the sun will rise, though it will provide no warmth worth mentioning, will merely illuminate the labor ahead without easing it. You stamp your feet one final time, flex your fingers inside gloves that are already inadequate, and step out onto the ice with the other men. It holds firm beneath your weight, solid and unyielding, winter made manifest. Somewhere beneath your boots, water still flows, dark and cold and patient, waiting for the moment when the ice will weaken and return to it. But that moment is months away. For now, the pond belongs to you and your fellow workers, and the harvest begins. The ice harvest did not begin on the morning you stepped onto that frozen pond. It began weeks earlier, perhaps months, in the quiet watching and waiting that preceded every successful harvest. To understand the labor of cutting ice, you must first understand the anxiety of wondering whether there would be ice to cut at all. Winter in Georgian England was not the reliable, predictable season that those in colder climates might take for granted. It was fickle, changeable, capable of delivering bitter freezes one year and mild dampness the next. And so, from the first frost of autumn onward, men whose livelihoods depended on the ice harvest watched the sky with a particular intensity, reading clouds and winds and temperatures the way scholars read books, searching for signs of the deep cold that would make their work possible. You learned to watch the weather from your father, who learned it from his father before him, a chain of knowledge stretching back through generations of men who worked the land and understood its rhythms intimately. You knew that frost alone meant nothing, that a single cold night could silver the grass and rim the pond's edge with delicate crystals without producing ice worth harvesting. What you needed was sustained cold, day after day of temperatures that never rose above freezing, nights that dropped so low the stars themselves seemed to shiver. You needed stillness, too, because wind disturbed the water's surface as it froze, creating ice that was cloudy and weak, riddled with air bubbles that would cause it to melt faster in storage. The perfect ice formed on calm, bitterly cold nights, growing slowly from the pond's edges inward, thickening hour by hour into something clear and strong and beautiful. December was the month of watching. You went about your other work, the diminished tasks that winter allowed. but always with one eye on the pond, one ear listening for reports from neighbors who had walked out to test its progress. The first ice was never trustworthy, a thin skin that might support a thrown stone but would shatter under the weight of a man. You learned this lesson young, as all children in these parts learned it, warned away from frozen ponds with stories of those who had fallen through and never emerged. The ice needed time to build upon itself, layer after layer of frozen water, accumulating until the surface could bear not just men, but horses and sledges laden with hundreds of pounds of harvested blocks. The estate's head gardener was responsible for determining when the harvest would begin, and he took this responsibility with appropriate gravity. His name was Mr. Ashworth, a man of perhaps 50 years who had served the family for 3 decades and who understood that his judgment in this matter could mean the difference between a full ice house and an empty one. Too early, and the ice might crack under the workers' weight, plunging men into freezing water, ruining the harvest before it properly began. Too late, and a sudden thaw might soften what had seemed solid, or snow might fall and insulate the ice from further cold, preventing it from reaching the thickness required for good keeping. Mr. Ashworth walked out onto the pond himself each morning in late December and early January, carrying a long iron rod that he used to test the ice's depth, chipping small holes and measuring with practiced eye how many inches had formed. 4 inches was the minimum. At 4 inches, the ice would support a man's weight, though barely, and careful work could begin at the edges where the ice was typically thickest. 5 inches was better, allowing men to work more freely, to move sledges across the surface without constant fear of breakthrough. 6 inches or more was ideal, ice so thick and strong that you could almost forget the dark water waiting beneath, could focus entirely on the labor of cutting and hauling without the persistent anxiety that the surface might give way. In the best years, when January brought week after week of bitter cold, the ice might reach 8 inches or even 10, and the harvest would be abundant. The ice house filled to capacity with blocks that would last well into autumn. But the best years were not every year, and the waiting carried with it a particular kind of dread. You had known seasons when the cold simply never came, when December remained mild and January brought rain instead of frost, when the pond never froze beyond a few inches of slushy, unreliable ice that no one dared harvest. Those years meant no work, no wages, a winter made even leaner by the absence of employment you had counted upon. You had known seasons when the cold came late, February finally delivering what January had denied, and the harvest proceeded in desperate haste, men working from before dawn until after dark to cut and store as much as possible before the inevitable thaw. You had known seasons when the cold came and then departed, a week of hard freeze followed by warming winds that softened the ice just as the harvest began, sending cracks racing across the pond's surface, forcing everyone to retreat to the banks and wait again. The tools of the harvest had to be ready before the ice was, and preparing them was its own kind of work. The saws needed sharpening, their long blades filed to edges that would bite cleanly through frozen water. The tongs needed checking, their iron jaws examined for cracks or weaknesses that might cause them to fail under load. The sledges needed repair, runners straightened, boards replaced where they had splintered during the previous year's work. The poles used for guiding floating blocks needed new iron tips if the old ones had worn thin. All of this preparation happened in barns and sheds during the weeks of waiting. Men working by firelight on tools they might or might not have occasion to use. Depending on what the weather decided, there was a shed on the estate where the ice harvesting equipment was stored, and you gathered there on certain evenings with the other men who would work the harvest, sharing news and speculation about when the call might come. The shed smelled of iron and oil and old wood, familiar scents that meant honest labor, and the conversation moved easily among men who had known each other for years, who had worked side by side through multiple winters, who understood one another's strengths and limitations without needing to discuss them. Thomas, with his damaged hands, could no longer work the saws effectively, but he was unmatched at packing the ice house, understanding instinctively how to layer blocks and straw for maximum preservation. Young Samuel was eager but clumsy, better suited to guiding sledges than handling the heavy tongs that required both strength and precision. You yourself had earned a reputation for working the saw, for cutting clean straight lines through the ice, for maintaining a steady rhythm that produced uniform blocks hour after hour. The waiting tested patience in ways that active labor never did. When you were working, there was no time to think, no energy to spare for worry or doubt. Your body moved and your mind emptied, and the hours passed in a blur of physical effort. But waiting meant thinking, and thinking meant worrying. Would the cold come? Would it last? Would there be enough work for everyone who needed it, or would some men be turned away? Would this be the year someone fell through the ice, the year of tragedy that everyone knew was always possible? These thoughts visited you in the evenings as you sat by your own small fire, watching the flames and listening to the wind outside, trying to judge from its direction and strength what the morning might bring. Your wife understood the waiting, had lived through enough winters to recognize the particular tension that gripped you during these weeks. She did not ask questions or offer false comfort, knowing that nothing she said could change the weather or hurry the ice. Instead, she simply continued with her own work, the endless domestic labor that sustained your household regardless of season. And her steadiness was its own kind of reassurance. The children, still young enough to find excitement in frozen puddles and icicles hanging from the eaves, did not understand why their father watched the sky so intently, why he walked to the pond and back each day even when there was nothing to do there. They would learn in time, as you had learned, that winter's gifts were never guaranteed, and that those who depended on them had to wait with patience. They did not always feel when the word finally came, carried by a boy running from the estate to the scattered cottages where the workers lived. You felt relief and dread in equal measure. The waiting was over. The ice was ready. Tomorrow the real work would begin, the brutal, exhausting, necessary work that would fill the ice house and earn you wages and leave you aching in every joint and muscle. You prepared what needed preparing, checked your clothing and your tools one final time, ate a larger supper than usual, knowing you would need the strength, and tried to sleep despite the anticipation that made rest difficult. The morning would come soon enough, bringing with it the cold and the labor and the strange satisfaction of doing work that mattered. Work that preserved something impossible. Work that captured winter itself and held it for the months ahead. The pond in the hour before dawn held a stillness that seemed almost sacred, a hush that made even the roughest men speak in lowered voices as they gathered at the water's edge. Torches had been lit and placed in iron brackets driven into the frozen ground, their flames dancing and flickering against the darkness, casting pools of orange light that reflected off the ice in strange, shifting patterns. The sky above remained black, though the eastern horizon had begun to show the faintest suggestion of gray, a promise that the sun would eventually rise, even if it offered no warmth worth mentioning. You stood with the other workers, perhaps 15 men in all, stamping your feet against the cold, watching your breath rise in thick clouds, waiting for the foreman to give the signal that would set the day's labor in motion. The first task was clearing the snow. A light fall had come 3 nights past, leaving perhaps 2 inches of white powder across the pond's surface, and this had to be removed before any cutting could begin. Snow was the enemy of good ice in multiple ways. It insulated the surface, preventing further freezing and even encouraging melting from below. It obscured the ice beneath, hiding cracks or thin spots that could prove dangerous. And it complicated the cutting process, turning to slush under boots and tools, making footing treacherous on a surface that was already difficult enough to navigate. So before the saws came out, before the real work began, there was the sweeping. You took up a wide broom made of bound birch twigs and stepped out onto the ice with the other men, spreading across the pond's surface in a rough line, pushing the snow ahead of you toward the banks. The work was simple but not easy, requiring constant motion to stay warm, demanding attention to footing on a surface that grew slicker as the snow was removed. The brooms made a rasping, scratching sound against the ice, a rhythm that built as more men joined the line, until the whole pond seemed to whisper and hiss with the collective effort of clearing. Your shoulders began to ache within the first half hour. The repetitive motion of sweeping, pulling at muscles that had not yet warmed to the day's demands. But you kept moving, kept pushing, because stopping meant cooling, and cooling meant suffering. And there were hours of harder work still ahead by the time the snow was cleared to the foreman's satisfaction. The sky had lightened considerably, though the sun itself remained hidden behind a low bank of clouds that promised neither warmth nor additional snow. The ice stretched before you now, revealed in its full expanse, a pale gray-white surface that seemed to glow faintly in the early morning light. You could see its quality even from the bank, the clarity that indicated proper freezing, the absence of the milky cloudiness that would have suggested weakness. This was good ice, the kind that would cut cleanly and keep well, and despite your exhaustion and the cold that had already crept into your bones, you felt a small surge of something like satisfaction. The waiting had been worth it. The harvest would be successful. The marking came next, a process that transformed the smooth expanse of ice into a grid of lines that would guide the cutting. A horse had been brought from the estate's stables, a sturdy draft animal accustomed to work and unbothered by the strange footing of the frozen pond. Attached to the horse was a wooden frame fitted with iron teeth that scratched shallow grooves into the ice as the animal walked. The foreman guided the horse in long straight lines from one end of the pond to the other, then turned and made perpendicular passes, creating a pattern of squares, approximately 20 inches on each side. These would be the blocks, uniform in size for easier packing, manageable in weight for the men who would haul them. The scratched lines caught the light differently than the unmarked ice, and soon the pond resembled nothing so much as an enormous game board, waiting for pieces to be removed. Now the saws came out, and with them the work that would define the rest of the day. The ice saws were unlike any other tool you used throughout the year, designed specifically for this single purpose. They were long, some nearly 5 feet from handle to tip, with wide blades and large teeth meant to bite through frozen water without binding or sticking. Working a saw required 2 men, one on each end, pulling back and forth in coordinated rhythm, the blade traveling along the scratched lines, cutting deeper with each pass. You paired with Thomas, as you often did, the two of you having developed over years of shared labor an understanding that required no words. He pulled, you pulled, he pulled, you pulled, the saw singing its harsh song as it chewed through the ice, the sound echoing across the pond and mixing with the identical sounds of other pairs. Working nearby, the first cuts were the hardest, requiring the most effort to establish the groove that the saw would follow. You pressed down with your weight as you pulled, forcing the teeth to bite, feeling the resistance of ice that did not want to yield. Chips and shavings flew up from the cut, catching the light like tiny diamonds before falling back to the surface. The cold made the work simultaneously easier and harder. Easier because the ice remained solid and predictable, did not soften or shift as it would in warmer temperatures. Harder because your body fought against the chill even as it worked, burning energy to stay warm that you would rather have spent on labor. Sweat formed beneath your wool clothing despite the cold, a clammy dampness that would turn frigid the moment you stopped moving. When a line was cut completely through, the ice along that line remained in place, held by the surrounding frozen surface. But a dark seam appeared, marking where water waited just below. These seams multiplied as the morning progressed, the grid pattern now showing not just scratched lines, but actual cuts, the blocks beginning to take shape as individual pieces rather than parts of a continuous whole. The next step was separating the blocks from one another and from the main body of ice, and this required the long, iron-tipped poles that several men now took up. They worked at the seams, prying and levering, applying pressure until, with a crack and a groan, block broke free and began to float in the narrow channel of dark water that had opened around it. The sight of that dark water never failed to send a small chill through you that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a reminder of what lay beneath, of the depth and cold that waited for anyone unlucky enough to break through. The freed blocks bobbed gently, their upper surfaces still dry and white with frost, their submerged portions showing the blue-green clarity of ice seen from within water. Men with poles guided these floating blocks toward the edge of the cutting area, pushing them along the channels toward the bank where others waited with tongs to haul them out. The blocks moved sluggishly, heavy with the weight of frozen water, requiring constant attention to prevent them from drifting back or jamming against one another. At the bank, the tongs came into play. These massive iron implements resembled giant scissors or the jaws of some prehistoric beast, designed to grip the sides of an ice block firmly enough to lift it clear of the water. Working the tongs required both strength and technique. You had to set the points into the ice at just the right angle, had to squeeze the handles with enough force to maintain your grip, had to lift and swing in a single, coordinated motion that brought the block up onto the bank without dropping it or losing your own balance. A block of ice 20 inches square and 5 inches thick weighed close to 100 pounds, and by midday you would have lifted hundreds of such blocks. Your arms and shoulders screaming with the effort, your hands cramped around the tong handles. Despite gloves that had long since soaked through, the blocks accumulated on the bank in growing piles, steam rising faintly from their surfaces where the relative warmth of the air began immediately to affect them. They could not stay here long. Every moment they spent above the water, exposed to whatever heat the day offered, was a moment of melting, of loss, of diminished quality. And so even as some men cut and others guided and others lifted, still others loaded the blocks onto wooden sledges that horses would drag to the ice house. The work was continuous, relentless, a chain of labor with no weak links permitted. A delay anywhere meant delays everywhere, meant ice sitting too long on the bank, meant a harvest smaller than it should have been. You fell into the rhythm of it as the morning stretched toward noon, your body finding the movements it remembered from previous years, your mind emptying of everything except the immediate task: cut, guide, lift, load, cut, guide, lift, load. The sun rose higher behind its veil of clouds, providing light but no comfort. Your wet boots had gone numb hours ago, your feet existing now as distant abstractions that you trusted to support you even though you could no longer feel them. Other men around you worked with the same mechanical persistence, faces red with cold and effort, breath coming in great clouds that marked each exertion. No one complained. No one stopped except to gulp water from flasks that had to be kept inside coats to prevent freezing. The harvest continued because it had to continue, because the ice would not wait. Months ahead would show no mercy to those who had failed to prepare. To understand where all this harvested ice was going, you must first understand the remarkable structures that waited to receive it. The ice houses of Georgian England were architectural marvels hidden in plain sight, buildings designed not to impress the eye but to perform a single function with extraordinary effectiveness. They were scattered across the great estates of the countryside, tucked into hillsides or buried beneath artificial mounds, their entrances often disguised as garden follies or concealed behind plantings of shrubs and trees. A visitor strolling the grounds of a fine manor house might walk directly past an ice house without ever realizing what lay beneath the grassy slope, without suspecting that just feet below the summer lawn, winter itself was being held captive in darkness and silence. The typical ice house began with excavation, a deep pit dug into the earth, often 20 feet down or more, far below the level where summer heat could easily penetrate. The shape was usually circular or oval, tapering slightly toward the bottom, creating a space that resembled nothing so much as a giant egg buried in the ground. The walls of this pit were lined with brick, layer upon careful layer. The bricks set without mortar in many cases to allow moisture to seep through rather than accumulating inside. This drainage was essential, for ice inevitably melted to some degree, and the water had to go somewhere. A channel cut into the floor of the pit carried meltwater to a drain that led away from the structure, preventing the ice from sitting in a pool of its own making. Above the pit rose a dome, also of brick, curving inward to meet at a point or a small flat cap at the top. This dome was the ice house's roof, but it was never left exposed to the elements. Instead, it was covered with earth, sometimes several feet deep, planted over with grass and wildflowers, until it resembled nothing more than a natural hillock. This earthen covering provided crucial insulation, protecting the dome from the direct heat, creating a buffer of soil and vegetation that kept the interior cool even when temperatures outside climbed to levels that would melt unprotected ice within hours. Some ice houses had trees planted atop them, their roots helping to stabilize the earthen mound while their branches provided additional shade. The entrance to an ice house was its most carefully designed feature, engineered to prevent the loss of cold air every time the door was opened, rather than a simple doorway leading directly into the storage chamber. Most ice houses featured a passage, sometimes 10 or 15 feet long, that angled downward from the entrance to the pit. This passage served as an airlock of sorts, trapping cold air that naturally sank and settled at the bottom, while preventing warm air from rushing in. Some passages included multiple doors, requiring anyone entering to close one door before opening the next, further protecting the precious cold within. The doors themselves were heavy, made of thick oak or elm, fitted tightly to their frames and often lined with straw or rushes for additional insulation. You had entered ice houses many times during previous harvests, descending into those dark passages to help with the packing of new ice, and the experience never failed to strike you with its strangeness. The transition was abrupt and absolute. One moment you stood in the ordinary world of daylight and weather, feeling whatever temperature the season offered. The next moment you were in a different world entirely, a world of permanent cold and darkness, where the air itself seemed thicker and heavier, where sounds were muffled and echoes behaved oddly, where your breath came in visible clouds, even in the middle of July. The temperature inside a well-maintained ice house might be 40 or 50 degrees colder than the world outside, a difference so dramatic that your body registered it as a physical shock. The darkness was nearly complete. Whatever light filtered through the entrance passage was swallowed by the depth of the pit, absorbed by the brick walls, lost in the sheer volume of cold, dark space. Workers entering the ice house carried lanterns or torches, but even these seemed diminished, their flames burning smaller and less brightly in the dense, cold air, their light reaching only a few feet before being swallowed by shadow. You learned to work in this darkness, to let your hands tell you what your eyes could not, to trust the spatial memory that developed after enough trips into these underground chambers. The walls were always where you expected them. The floor sloped consistently toward the drain. The shelves and supports maintained their positions year after year. The smell of an ice house was distinctive, impossible to mistake for anything else. It was the smell of cold itself, if cold can be said to have a smell, a sharp, clean scent that cleared the sinuses and seemed to coat the inside of your throat. Beneath that was the smell of damp brick and old straw, of earth and stone, of something ancient and mineral that spoke of the deep ground from which the structure had been carved. In summer, when the ice house had been sealed for months and then opened for the first time, there was sometimes a staleness to the air, a quality of having been breathed by no one for too long. But this dissipated quickly as fresh air cycled through the entrance passage. The ice house on the estate where you worked was considered a fine example of its kind, built perhaps 50 years earlier by the current lord's grandfather, who had employed an architect from London to design it according to the latest principles. It could hold, when properly packed, enough ice to supply the household through even the longest, hottest summer, with surplus remaining for emergencies or unexpected entertaining. The pit was 18 feet deep and 12 feet across, the dome rising another 10 feet above the pit's rim before the earthen mound began. The entrance passage was lined with stone rather than brick, and included 3 separate doors, each heavier than the last, each fitted with iron hardware that had been regularly oiled to prevent rust in the damp environment. You had heard of ice houses that were less well designed, structures that failed to keep their contents frozen much past June, that required constant replenishment if the household wished to have ice in August. Poor drainage was often the culprit, allowing meltwater to pool at the bottom of the pit, surrounding the remaining ice with relatively warm water that accelerated the melting process. Inadequate insulation was another common problem, earth coverings too thin to protect against summer heat, or entrance passages too short to prevent warm air infiltration. Some ice houses had been built in unfortunate locations, on south-facing slopes where the sun beat down relentlessly, or in low-lying areas where warm air pooled and lingered. These design flaws could render an ice house nearly useless, a great investment of construction effort that failed to perform its essential function. But a well-built ice house, like the one you helped to fill each winter, was a genuine wonder of practical engineering. It solved the problem that had vexed humanity for millennia, the problem of preserving cold in a world that naturally warmed. It did so without machinery or fuel, using only the principles of insulation and thermal mass that its builders understood through experience, if not through scientific theory. It was a partnership between human ingenuity and natural forces, a structure that worked with the Earth's tendency to maintain stable temperatures, that exploited the simple fact that cold air sinks and warm air rises. Standing in the darkness of the ice house, surrounded by the chill that seemed to press against you from every direction, you could not help but feel a kind of respect for whoever had first conceived of such a thing, whoever had first thought to dig deep into the ground and build a chamber for holding winter. The ice house waited now, in January, empty of the previous year's supply, which had been gradually consumed through autumn until nothing remained but meltwater trickling down the drain and the lingering cold that never entirely dissipated even when no ice was present. The straw that had insulated last year's harvest lay matted and damp on the floor, and this would need to be removed and replaced before the new ice could be packed. The walls had been inspected in December, checked for any cracks or damage that might compromise the structure's integrity, and found to be sound. Everything was ready. The pit waited to be filled. The darkness waited to receive its cargo of frozen water, and the work of preservation was about to begin. The sledges arrived throughout the morning and into the afternoon, each one dragged by a patient horse whose breath rose in great plumes against the cold air, each one laden with blocks of ice that glistened and steamed faintly as they sat exposed to whatever warmth the January day offered. The journey from the pond to the ice house was perhaps a quarter-mile, following a path that the estate's workers had used for decades, packed hard by the passage of countless previous loads. The horses knew this path well, required little guidance, plodded along with the steady resignation of animals who understood work as their purpose in life. Their hooves rang against the frozen ground, and the sledge runners hissed and scraped, and the ice shifted slightly with each bump and dip in the terrain, settling against itself with soft crystalline sounds. At the ice house, the real art of preservation began. Cutting ice was hard labor, certainly back-breaking work that left men exhausted and aching. But cutting was also relatively straightforward, a matter of strength and endurance applied to a simple task. Packing the ice house was different. Packing required knowledge, judgment, a feel for how blocks should be arranged that could only be developed through years of experience. Packed poorly, ice would melt within weeks. The household's investment in labor and storage wasted long before summer arrived. Packed well, ice could last for months, even a year if necessary. Emerging from the darkness of the ice house, as solid and clear as the day it was harvested. The difference between poor packing and good packing was the difference between failure and success. And everyone involved in the harvest understood this. The first step was preparing the floor of the ice house with a thick layer of straw. You descended into the pit with armloads of clean, dry straw, spreading it evenly across the brick floor to a depth of perhaps 18 inches. This straw served multiple purposes. It insulated the ice from the relative warmth of the earth below, which even at this depth maintained temperatures somewhat above freezing. It provided cushioning that prevented the bottommost blocks from cracking under the weight of those stacked above, and it absorbed the meltwater that inevitably accumulated, keeping the ice above the moisture rather than sitting in it. The straw needed to be dry and clean, free of dirt or debris that might contaminate the ice, and this was checked carefully before any block was lowered into the pit. Then came the ice itself, block by block, lowered down the entrance passage and into the pit by a chain of men working in careful coordination. The blocks were heavy and awkward, slippery despite the cold, requiring strength and attention to handle safely. At the top of the passage, men lifted blocks from the sledges and passed them to others waiting just inside the first door. These men passed them further along to others stationed deeper in the passage, and finally to those in the pit itself who received each block and carried it to its designated position. The chain had to move smoothly, without pauses or drops, because ice sitting in the passage was ice exposed to warmer air, ice that was beginning to melt even as it waited. Speed mattered, but not at the expense of care. Inside the pit, the packing proceeded according to principles that Thomas had taught you years ago. Principles he had learned from his own father, and that likely stretched back to the earliest ice houses built in England. The first blocks went around the edges of the pit, fitted tightly against the brick walls, with their cut surfaces facing inward. The walls of the pit, despite the insulation of the earth beyond, remained the warmest part of the structure, and ice placed directly against them would melt first. By lining the walls with a layer of straw, and then positioning blocks with minimal contact against that straw, you created a buffer that protected the ice in the center. It was this central ice that would last longest, that would still be solid in August, when the outer layers had long since surrendered to the creeping warmth. Each layer of blocks had to be fitted carefully, with gaps between blocks kept as small as possible. Where gaps existed, and air was the enemy of preservation. Still, air trapped between tightly packed blocks remained cold, became almost part of the ice itself, but gaps that connected to other gaps allowed circulation, allowed warmer air from above to work its way down and accelerate melting. You filled the smallest gaps with crushed ice and snow, packing it in with your hands, forcing it into every crevice until the layer was as close to a solid mass as human effort could make it. Your hands, even through gloves, grew numb with the work. But you continued because you knew the importance of what you were doing. Between layers of ice came layers of straw, thinner than the base layer, but still substantial, perhaps 6 inches deep. This straw served the same insulating purpose, creating barriers that slowed the transfer of heat from the air above to the ice below. The straw was packed down firmly, compressed until it would take no more compression, then covered with the next layer of ice blocks. Layer upon layer, the pit filled, the darkness seeming to deepen as the pile grew higher, the cold intensifying as more and more frozen water accumulated in the confined space. Your breath came in great clouds that hung in the still air, slowly dissipating but never entirely disappearing, and you could feel the temperature dropping around you with each block that was added to the store. The work was exhausting in ways different from the cutting and hauling at the pond. Here, in the pit, you could not move freely, could not stretch or walk to ease cramped muscles. The space was confined, the footing uncertain on the uneven surface of stacked blocks and packed straw, and you had to maintain constant attention to avoid slipping or dropping a block on your foot or someone else's. The lantern light was insufficient, casting more shadow than illumination, and you worked largely by feel, letting your hands guide blocks into position, trusting your spatial sense to tell you when a layer was complete. The men working in the pit rotated regularly, climbing back up the passage for a few minutes of relatively fresh air before descending again to continue the packing. As the pile grew higher, approaching the level of the entrance passage, the nature of the work changed. No longer were you building up from a floor below. Now you were filling a space that closed in around you, the dome of the ice house curving overhead, limiting headroom and making movement even more awkward. The final blocks had to be lifted nearly to shoulder height, positioned on top of a mass that now contained tons of frozen water, packed with straw that was becoming difficult to spread evenly in the cramped conditions. But still you continued, because every block added was insurance against summer heat, was another day of cold preserved, was another moment when the household could have what nature had not designed them to have: ice in July, ice in August, ice when the world outside baked under a remorseless sun, The final layer was straw alone, a thick blanket of dry golden stems spread across the top of the ice. This layer was perhaps 2 feet deep, compressed as much as possible, creating a barrier between the stored ice and the air in the upper part of the dome. Some ice houses featured wooden platforms installed at this level, creating a false ceiling that further separated the storage area from the entrance. But this one relied on straw alone. The straw was cheaper, more easily replaced each year, and in practice proved just as effective if properly maintained. You spread it carefully, making sure no gaps existed at the edges where the straw met the walls, tucking it in and pressing it down until you were satisfied that the ice below was as well protected as human effort could make it. Then came the sealing of the doors. Each one closed and latched in sequence as the workers retreated from the pit, leaving behind the darkness and the cold, and the tons of frozen water that would not see daylight again for months. The final door, the one that faced the outer world, was checked and rechecked, its fit examined for any gaps where warm air might infiltrate. Some estates wedged straw into the door frames as additional insurance, and this was done here. Handfuls of clean, dry straw pressed into every crevice until the seal was as complete as possible. Then you stepped back into the January afternoon that now felt almost warm compared to the depths you had just left, and the work of packing was done. The icehouse door closed with a sound of finality, the heavy oak settling into its frame with a thud that seemed to echo across the estate grounds, before being swallowed by the winter silence. And then began the long waiting, the months of preservation during which the ice you had worked so hard to harvest and pack would sit in darkness, slowly surrendering to forces that could be delayed but never entirely defeated. You would not enter that ice house again until perhaps March or April, when the estate's steward would make the first inspection of the season. And even then, your presence would likely not be required. The ice was on its own now, its fate determined by the quality of the structure that housed it, the skill with which it had been packed, and the unpredictable weather that the coming months would bring. February passed quietly, as Februaries do, the cold maintaining its grip on the land. The pond where you had harvested ice remaining frozen solid, sometimes accumulating new layers that would never be collected. You returned to the other work that filled the winter months, the repair of tools and fences, the care of livestock through the leanest season, the small indoor tasks that could be accomplished when the ground was too hard for plowing and the days too short for much outdoor labor. You thought occasionally of the ice house, wondering how the stores were faring. But there was nothing to be done about it now. The ice would keep or it would not, and worrying changed nothing. The science of what was happening inside that sealed chamber was not something you understood in formal terms, but you grasped the essential principles through experience and observation. The ice sat in its bed of straw, radiating cold into the air around it, maintaining the temperature inside the pit at levels far below what existed in the outside world. As long as the pit remained cold enough, the ice would remain solid, losing only minimal amounts to the slow, inevitable melting that occurred even under ideal conditions. The meltwater trickled away through the drain, carrying with it the heat energy that had been absorbed by the ice as it transformed from solid to liquid. This was the price of preservation, the tax that nature extracted, the slow diminishment that could not be avoided. March brought the first hints of change, the days growing noticeably longer, the angle of the sun shifting so that midday light fell differently across the estate. The snow that had blanketed the grounds began to recede, revealing the brown grass beneath, and the pond's ice softened and grew unreliable, losing the thickness that had made it harvestable. Spring was coming, though it would be weeks yet before it truly arrived. And with spring came the first real test of the icehouse's effectiveness. The earth covering the dome began to warm, the grass on its surface turning from winter brown to the pale green of new growth. And this warmth crept slowly inward, pressing against the insulation, reaching toward the cold stored below. The estate's steward, a man named Fletcher, who had served the family for nearly 20 years, made his first inspection of the ice house in late March. You were not present for this inspection, but you heard the results secondhand, passed along through the chain of servants and workers who carried information across the estate like water through channels. The news was good. The ice had settled somewhat, as it always did, the uppermost layers showing some melting, but the bulk of the stores remained solid and sound. Fletcher estimated that perhaps 15% had been lost to the winter months, a reasonable figure that suggested the packing had been done well and the structure was performing as designed. April brought true spring, the warming that transformed the landscape from brown to green seemingly overnight, the return of birdsong and buzzing insects, the loosening of the earth so that plowing and planting could finally begin. Your days filled with the urgent work of the agricultural year, the narrow window during which seeds had to go into the ground if harvest was to come in autumn. You thought less of the ice house now, your attention consumed by immediate concerns, but it remained somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet awareness that beneath that grassy mound, winter was still being held prisoner. May and June saw the ice house opened more frequently as the household's demand for cold began to increase. Servants descended into the pit to retrieve blocks for the kitchen, where the cook required ice for chilling creams and setting jellies, for keeping meat fresh a few days longer than it would otherwise keep, for the countless small applications that made summer cooking more manageable. Each opening of the ice house was carefully managed. The doors opened only as long as absolutely necessary, the blocks retrieved quickly, and the chambers sealed again before too much warm air could infiltrate. Even so, each opening cost something, accelerated the melting slightly, reduced the stores that had to last until next winter's harvest. The steward kept careful records of how much ice was removed and when, tracking consumption against the remaining supply, calculating whether the household's appetites would outstrip the ice house's capacity. In years when spring came early and hot, when summer settled in with brutal intensity and refused to relent, these calculations became anxious exercises, the steward balancing the family's desires against the reality of a finite resource. Some years required rationing, the cook informed that ice would only be available for certain purposes, that the elaborate frozen desserts requested for a dinner party were simply not possible given the current state of the stores. These conversations were never easy, but they were necessary. The steward standing firm against pressure from above, because he alone understood how little remained in the darkness below. July was the cruelest month for ice preservation, the height of summer bringing temperatures that pressed relentlessly against the defenses of even the best-built icehouse. The ground around the structure warmed thoroughly, the insulating effect of the earthen dome diminished, and the air inside the pit grew noticeably less cold despite the remaining ice. You could track the progress of melting by the sound of water in the drain, a trickle in spring that became a steady flow by midsummer, carrying away what remained of January's harvest, one drop at a time. Some years the ice lasted comfortably through July and into August with stores to spare. Other years the melt accelerated alarmingly, the steward reporting weekly losses that seemed impossible. The household facing the prospect of an iceless August with something approaching genuine concern. August brought decisions that revealed priorities. The family determining what uses of ice were essential and what could be foregone. Ice for the sickroom, certainly, for cooling feverish brows and providing cold compresses for various ailments. Ice for preserving medicines that required cold storage, keeping them effective when they might otherwise spoil. Ice for the most important entertaining, the dinners and parties that maintained social connections and demonstrated status. But ice cream for ordinary family meals became a luxury that could not always be afforded, and the cook learned to adapt to create summer desserts that required no cold, to serve fruits fresh from the garden rather than chilled from the icehouse. September saw the crisis ease. If crisis it had been, the cooling nights and shorter days reducing the pressure on the icehouse, slowing the relentless melting that had characterized the summer months. What remained of the ice, perhaps a quarter of what had been packed in January, would last now through autumn and into winter, when it would be needed less anyway, and when the new harvest would soon replenish the stores. The annual cycle was nearing its end, the icehouse preparing to receive new cargo, the old stores having served their purpose of carrying cold from one winter to the next. You thought sometimes about the strangeness of this cycle, the way that work done in January bitter, backbreaking work performed in conditions that bordered on dangerous, sustained, pleasures enjoyed in July by people who would never know your face or name. The connection between your labor and their comfort was direct and undeniable, yet invisible, mediated by months of time and layers of servants and structures designed to preserve without ever calling attention to themselves. The icehouse was a machine for separating cause from effect, for making the impossible seem effortless, for hiding the winter's work so thoroughly that summer's guests might genuinely believe that cold in July was simply natural, simply available, simply part of what wealth and position entitled one to expect. The dining room of the great house glittered in the light of 100 candles, their flames reflected in crystal glasses and polished silver. In the gleaming surface of mahogany stretched long enough to seat 20 guests. It was an evening in late July, the air outside still heavy with the heat of day, the gardens beyond the tall windows drowsing in the lingering twilight. Inside, however, the atmosphere was one of elegant refinement, the women in silk gowns and the men in embroidered waistcoats, conversation flowing as easily as the wine that servants poured from bottles brought up cold from the cellars. And at the center of the table, surrounded by arrangements of hothouse flowers and pyramids of summer fruit, sat something that drew admiring glances from every guest, a great silver bowl filled with ice cream, its surface smooth and pale, its presence a small miracle that most of those assembled did not pause to consider. The journey from icehouse to table was a feat of coordination that occurred entirely beyond the awareness of those who benefited from it. Early that afternoon, a servant had descended into the darkness beneath the grassy mound and retrieved a block of ice that had been harvested 6 months prior, had been cut from the frozen pond where you had worked through that bitter January day, had been packed in straw and left in silence while the world above warmed and greened. The block was carried to the kitchen, where it was broken into smaller pieces with an ice pick, the chunks placed in a wooden bucket and packed with salt. The ice and salt together, creating a cold far more intense than ice alone could achieve. Into this frigid bath went a metal container holding a sweet cream mixture, flavored with vanilla imported from distant tropical islands, and a kitchen maid spent the better part of an hour turning the container and scraping its sides, encouraging the cream to freeze evenly into the smooth consistency that the household expected. Ice cream arrived at table in a porcelain dish nestled within a silver stand, designed to insulate it from the warmth of the room, to preserve its frozen state for the duration of the desert course. The guests received it with appreciation that stopped well short of wonder, for ice cream was no novelty to people of their station, was simply one of the pleasures that wealth and good management provided. They ate it with silver spoons, commenting on the quality of the vanilla, the smoothness of the texture, the perfect balance of sweetness that the cook had achieved. They did not think of the frozen pond or the workers who had labored upon it. They did not imagine the ice house with its layers of straw and brick, its carefully managed darkness. They simply enjoyed what was placed before them, as they enjoyed everything that their position in the world entitled them to enjoy. Yet in that moment, invisible connections stretched backward through time and outward through space, linking the silver spoons to the iron tongs, the porcelain dish to the muddy banks of the winter pond, the elegant guests to the laborers whose names they would never know. Every bite of ice cream contained within it the physical reality of your January morning, the ache of your muscles and the numbness of your feet, the rhythm of the saw and the splash of blocks dropping free into dark water. The cold that touched their tongues was the cold you had captured and carried and packed away in straw, preserved through spring and summer by the skill of builders who had designed a structure for exactly this purpose. They were eating, in a very real sense, a piece of last winter, a memory of January served in July. The uses of ice at tables like this one extended far beyond ice cream, though ice cream was certainly the most celebrated application. Wine was chilled by plunging bottles into buckets filled with ice and water, bringing the temperature down to levels that enhanced the flavor and provided refreshment against the summer heat. Butter was kept cold in special dishes designed with ice compartments, preventing it from softening into unusable puddles during long meals. Fruit was sometimes served on beds of crushed ice, the grapes and peaches and apricots glistening with moisture, appearing impossibly fresh and inviting. Even the drinking water for formal dinners might be chilled, a refinement that distinguished the best tables from those that could not. manage such attention to detail. The science of cold was imperfectly understood in this era, but its effects were observed and exploited with considerable sophistication. Hosts and cooks knew that cold foods provided relief from summer heat, that chilled beverages refreshed the body in ways that tepid drinks could not. They knew that certain flavors were enhanced by cold, that sweetness became more pronounced and textures more pleasing when temperatures were lowered. They knew that the presentation of ice cream and ices carried social meaning, demonstrated that the household possessed both the resources to maintain an ice house and the management skills to preserve its contents through the summer. Ice was, in this sense, as much about status as about sensation, a way of signaling position and capability to guests, who understood exactly what such displays implied. The servants who carried ice from the ice house to the kitchen, who transformed blocks into crushed ice and buckets of salty mixture, occupied a strange middle position in this economy of cold. They understood, as the guests did not, exactly where the ice came from and what effort its preservation required. They had seen the ice house opened and closed, had descended into its darkness, had felt the cold that radiated from walls packed with January's harvest. Yet they too maintained a certain distance from the original labor, treating ice as a resource to be managed rather than a product of specific human effort. The kitchen maid who churned ice cream did not think of the men at the pond. She thought of the consistency of the cream and the timing of her movements and the expectations of the cook who supervised her work. There were households where ice was used more sparingly, where the ice house was smaller or less well maintained, where summer supplies ran short before the season's entertaining concluded. In such houses, ice cream might appear only at the most important dinners. Wine might be chilled only for the most distinguished guests, and the servants learned to stretch their resources with the same careful attention that governed every aspect of household management. The allocation of ice became a matter of domestic politics, the cook negotiating with the housekeeper consulting with the lady of the house, everyone aware that the ice house contained a finite supply that had to last until winter made replenishment possible in the very grandest establishments, where wealth exceeded even the considerable norms of Georgian aristocracy. Ice might be used with an extravagance that seemed designed to demonstrate that economy was beneath consideration. Ice sculptures appeared at the most lavish entertainments, carved swans and classical figures that melted slowly over the course of an evening, their diminishment itself a kind of performance, a visible representation of wealth sufficient to waste what others hoarded. Entire rooms might be cooled by basins of ice placed strategically near doorways, the cold air flowing outward to provide relief for guests dancing in summer ballrooms. These displays were excessive by any practical measure, but practicality was precisely what they were designed to transcend. They announced that this household operated according to different rules, that the constraints governing lesser establishments simply did not apply. The guests at the dinner table that July evening finished their ice cream and moved on to other pleasures, to brandy and conversation, to music in the drawing room and moonlit walks in the garden. The silver bowl was carried back to the kitchen, its contents exhausted, its purpose served. The ice that remained from the evening's entertainments, the chunks in buckets, and the shavings on the kitchen floor, would melt by morning into ordinary water that would drain away and be forgotten. The ice house would be opened again tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever the household's demands required, and more of January's harvest would begin its journey toward consumption and disappearance. And somewhere in the village beyond the estate's boundaries, you slept in your small cottage, unaware of the dinner party that had just concluded, unaware that the ice you had cut and hauled and packed had provided a moment of pleasure for people whose lives barely intersected with your own. The distance between your world and theirs was measured not in miles, but in assumptions, in expectations, in the fundamental structures of a society that required your labor while rendering you invisible. The ice connected you, briefly and impersonally, creating a chain of causation that stretched from your frozen hands to their silver spoons. But the connection carried no recognition, no acknowledgement, no gratitude beyond the wages you had already been paid and spent. The ice was simply ice, a commodity, a convenience, something that existed because the system that produced it functioned as designed. Who were you, truly? The men who walked onto frozen ponds before dawn and spent your days in labor that would benefit people you would never meet? What lives did you return to when the ice harvest ended and the ice house was sealed and the wages were counted and spent? The history that remembers Georgian England tends to focus on the great houses and their inhabitants, on the politics and culture of the wealthy, on the transformations of industry and empire that would reshape the world. But that history often overlooks the workers, the countless men and women whose labor made everything else possible, whose lives were lived in the margins and gaps of a society that took their existence for granted. You were agricultural laborers, most of you men born into families that had worked the land for generations, whose fathers and grandfathers had lived in the same villages and worked the same fields and occupied the same position in a hierarchy that seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the landscape itself. You did not own the land you worked, had no claim to its products beyond the wages you received, possessed no security beyond your ability to continue laboring and the willingness of those above you to continue employing you. Your lives were shaped by the agricultural calendar, by the planting and growing and harvesting that determined when work was available and when it was not, by the rhythms of seasons that offered plenty in summer and scarcity in winter. The ice harvest represented one of the few opportunities for paid employment during the lean winter months, and you accepted it despite its brutality because the alternative was worse. The alternative was no work at all, no wages, no money for bread or fuel or the small necessities that kept a family alive until spring brought employment back to the fields. You were grateful for the work, genuinely grateful, even as you dreaded it, even as you knew it would leave your body aching and your health diminished and your hands marked by damage that would linger for months. Gratitude and dread coexisted in you without contradiction, two aspects of a single reality that governed every decision you made about how to survive in a world that offered few good options. The wages for ice harvesting varied from estate to estate and year to year, but they were never generous. You might earn a shilling or two for a full day's work, enough to buy bread for your family for perhaps a week, enough to make a small but meaningful difference in the calculations of winter survival. The work was paid by the day rather than by the block which meant that the speed of the harvest made no difference to your income. You were paid for your time, not your productivity. And the foreman's demands for speed served the estate's interests rather than your own. Some men worked faster anyway, driven by the hope that good performance might lead to additional employment, or simply by the desire to stay warm through constant motion. You were paid in coin, usually the small silver and copper pieces that circulated through the rural economy, changing hands at markets and shops and alehouses, flowing from employers to workers to merchants in patterns that distributed the wealth of the countryside in ways that left most of it concentrated at the top. What you earned at the ice harvest you spent quickly on necessities that could not be postponed, on food and fuel, and the few items of clothing that might make the remainder of winter more bearable. There was no surplus, no savings, no accumulation of capital that might one day lift you from your position. The wages came and went, and you remained where you had always been, waiting for the next opportunity to earn enough to survive until the next opportunity after that. The injuries of the ice harvest were common and various, ranging from minor discomforts that faded within days to permanent damage that followed men through the rest of their shortened lives. Frostbite was nearly universal, affecting fingers and toes and ears and noses, ranging from the superficial reddening and peeling that healed without incident to the deep tissue damage that turned flesh black and sometimes required amputation to prevent worse outcomes. You had seen men lose fingers to frostbite, had watched as the blackened digits were removed by the local surgeon or simply fell away on their own, leaving stumps that ached in cold weather for as long as their owners lived. Falls on the ice were frequent, the slippery surface betraying even the most careful workers, sending men crashing down onto a surface harder than any floor. Bruises and sprains were everyday occurrences, accepted as part of the work, endured without complaint because complaining changed nothing. Broken bones were less common but not rare, and a broken bone in January could mean months of lost work, months of depending on family or charity, months of watching your position in the local labor market erode as younger and healthier men took the jobs you could no longer perform. The ice harvest aged men faster than almost any other work, compressing decades of wear into seasons of brutal labor. The worst injury, the one that everyone feared, even if they rarely spoke of it, was falling through the ice into the water below. This happened rarely, but it happened especially in years when the ice was marginal, when the harvest proceeded despite conditions that were not quite ideal, because waiting longer risked not being able to harvest at all. A man who fell through the ice had only minutes to be rescued before the cold killed him. And even successful rescue often led to illness or death in the days that followed. The shock to the system, too great for bodies already weakened by poor nutrition and constant labor. You knew men who had fallen through. Some had survived, pulled out by quick-thinking companions, stripped of their wet clothes and wrapped in whatever was available, carried back to warmth and nursed through the following days of fever and shaking. Others had not been so lucky. The homes you returned to after a day on the ice offered limited comfort, though they were all the comfort you knew. Small cottages of stone or timber, often just a single room heated by a fire that burned whatever fuel could be obtained. Wood if you were fortunate enough to have access to forest land, peat if you lived where peat could be cut, coal if you lived near enough to the emerging mining districts to afford it. The fire was the center of domestic life, the source of heat and light and cooking, the gathering point for families who had no other rooms to retreat to, no other spaces that offered warmth or illumination. Your wife, if you had one, managed the household with skills as demanding in their way as any you exercised in the fields or on the ice. She stretched meager supplies across days and weeks, knew how to make a little food seem like more, understood the arts of preservation and preparation that kept families fed when resources were scarce. She bore children, many of them often, and buried some of them too. Infant mortality being a constant presence in communities where medical care was primitive and nutrition inadequate. She grew old before her time, as you did, worn down by labor and childbirth and the accumulated stresses of a life that offered little ease. The children grew up in this world, learning from their earliest years that work was the price of survival, that their small bodies could contribute to the family's welfare through tasks matched to their limited strength. They gathered fuel and carried water and watched younger siblings and performed the countless small services that slightly eased their parents' burdens. They did not attend school, most of them, education being a luxury that few laboring families could afford in time or money. What they learned from their parents and their neighbors. The practical knowledge of how to live in a world that had no particular interest in their flourishing. You did not think of yourself as oppressed, exactly because oppression implies a sense that things should be different, that the structures governing your life are unjust and changeable. The system that determined your place in the world seemed as natural and permanent as the weather, as unchangeable as the turning of the seasons. There had always been wealthy families and poor ones, always been those who labored and those who benefited from that labor, always been a hierarchy that put you near the bottom and offered no ladder to climb higher. You accepted this, more or less, because accepting it was easier than raging against something you could not change. Because the energy required for resentment was energy you needed for survival. And yet there were moments, perhaps on a January morning, as you stood on the frozen pond, watching your breath rise into the darkness, when something like awareness flickered through you. An understanding that the world did not have to be arranged this way, that the ice you were cutting would bring pleasure to people who would never know your name or care about your suffering, that the gap between their world and yours was maintained by structures that benefited them and burdened you. These moments passed quickly, pushed aside by the immediate demands of the work at hand, by the cold that required constant movement, by the rhythm of labor that left no space for extended reflection. But they existed, these flickerings of consciousness, seeds of something that would eventually grow into movements and demands and transformations that would reshape the world you lived in. For now, though, you returned to your cottage at the end of a day on the ice, ate what simple food your wife had prepared, sat by the fire as feeling slowly returned to your frozen extremities, and slept the heavy sleep of physical exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, another day on the ice if the harvest continued, or another day of whatever work you could find if it did not. Your life proceeded in this way, day following day, season following season, year following year, until eventually it would end, and someone else would take your place in the chain of labor that kept the great houses supplied with their impossible comforts. The fading of a trade and closing reflection. Nothing lasts forever, not even traditions that seem as permanent as the turning of the seasons. The ice houses of Georgian England, those remarkable structures that held winter captive beneath summer lawns, would eventually fall silent, their purpose made obsolete by changes that no one in your generation could have predicted. The trade you practiced, the skills you possessed, the knowledge passed down through generations of workers who understood how to harvest and preserve ice, would gradually become unnecessary, and then forgotten, and then relegated to the realm of historical curiosity. The world was changing, though you could not see it from your position on the frozen pond, and the changes would sweep away much of what you knew. The first hints of transformation came from across the Atlantic, from the young nation of America, where an entrepreneur named Frederick Tudor began experimenting with something that seemed almost absurd: shipping ice from frozen New England lakes to warm southern ports where ice had never existed naturally. The initial ventures failed spectacularly, the ice melting long before it reached its destination, the business logic seemingly impossible. But Tudor persisted with the obsessive determination of a man convinced he had seen the future, and gradually he learned to insulate his cargo with sawdust, to minimize losses through careful packing, to create supply chains that could move ice across thousands of miles of ocean. By the 1830s and 1840s, American ice was arriving in British ports, and it was cheaper than anyone had thought possible. The economics were devastating for local ice harvests. An estate that had maintained its own pond and ice house for generations, that had employed local workers each January to cut and haul and pack, found that it could simply purchase American ice at prices lower than the cost of producing it locally. The ice arrived already cut into uniform blocks, arrived in quantities that overwhelmed anything a single pond could produce, arrived with a reliability that English winters could not guarantee. Why maintain an ice house when ice could be delivered to your door? Why employ workers when merchants would handle everything? The logic was irresistible, and one by one the estates that had supported the local ice trade began to abandon it. Norwegian ice followed American ice into British markets, arriving from fjords that froze deeper and colder and more reliably than any English pond. The Norwegians had perfected techniques of harvesting on an industrial scale, employing hundreds of workers to cut ice from lakes that stretched for miles, packing it into ships that carried thousands of tons at a time. The ice trade became an industry unto itself, with dedicated ports and warehouses, with distribution networks that reached every major city in Britain, with prices that continued to fall as competition intensified and efficiency improved. The ice house on the local estate, once a marvel of preservation, became merely a convenient storage point for ice purchased elsewhere. The workers who had practiced the trade of ice harvesting found their skills suddenly worthless. Their seasonal employment evaporated, their small but crucial winter wages no longer available. Some adapted, finding other work to fill the gap, accepting that this was simply how the world changed, that trades rose and fell according to rhythms beyond any individual's control. Others struggled, particularly the older men whose bodies had been shaped by decades of specific labor and who found it difficult to learn new ways of working. The ice harvest had been hard, but it had been theirs, a tradition understood and practiced by their fathers and their fathers' fathers, and its loss carried a weight of meaning beyond mere economic calculation. Then came refrigeration, the technology that would make even imported natural ice obsolete. Mechanical refrigeration, the ability to create cold through the compression and expansion of gases, emerged gradually through the middle and late decades of the 19th century, beginning as an industrial curiosity and spreading slowly into commercial and eventually domestic applications. The first refrigerated ships appeared in the 1870s, carrying frozen meat from Australia and New Zealand to British tables, revolutionizing food distribution in ways that made the old ice trade seem quaint and limited. Factories installed refrigeration systems that could produce ice artificially, creating in minutes what nature took weeks of bitter cold to form, producing it year-round without dependence on weather or season. Their purpose eliminated by technologies that performed the same function more reliably and cheaply. Some were converted to other purposes, their cool, dark chambers becoming wine cellars or storage for garden equipment. Others were simply abandoned, their doors sealed and left to weather and decay, their entrance passages filling with leaves and debris, their domed structures gradually collapsing or settling into the earth from which they had been built. The grass that had grown atop them continued to grow, thickening into meadow, and the trees that had been planted for shade reached maturity and then declined, and eventually the ice houses became invisible, mere irregularities in the landscape that visitors walked past without understanding what lay beneath. Scattered across the grounds of historic estates throughout Britain, their presence marked by subtle depressions in the earth or mysterious doorways leading into grassy mounds. Some have been restored and opened to visitors, interpreted as examples of ingenious pre-industrial engineering, explained through plaques and guided tours that describe how ice was harvested and stored before electricity made such efforts unnecessary. Others remain hidden, known only to groundskeepers and local historians, their locations passed down through oral tradition or rediscovered through archaeological investigation. They are monuments to a vanished trade, physical evidence of a time when cold was precious and its preservation required both skill and effort. You, of course, saw none of this. Your life unfolded and concluded long before the changes that would render your work obsolete, long before anyone could imagine a world where ice was manufactured rather than harvested, where cold was available at the touch of a button rather than the product of months of careful labor. You lived within your time, experienced its constraints and possibilities, and died without knowing that the skills you possessed would become historical curiosities within a few generations. This is how it is with most human lives, most human knowledge, most human traditions. They serve their purpose for a time, and then circumstances change, and what once seemed essential becomes merely interesting, a subject for historians and documentarians, and those who find value in understanding how people once lived. Yet something persists beyond the obvious utility of the trade itself. The ice houses remain as evidence of human ingenuity applied to a fundamental problem, the problem of preserving cold in a world that naturally warms. the solutions developed by generations of builders and workers, the understanding of insulation and thermal mass and drainage and air circulation represented genuine engineering achievement, practical knowledge refined through experience and observation over decades and centuries. This knowledge did not disappear when refrigeration arrived. It was absorbed and transformed, incorporated into the new technologies in ways that are not always obvious but remain fundamentally important. The principles that governed icehouse design still govern cold storage today, still shape how we think about preserving temperature differences against the equilibrating tendencies of nature and the workers themselves. The men whose names were never recorded and whose faces were never painted, who lived their lives in labor and died leaving nothing behind but the children, who carried their blood forward and the skills that eventually became unnecessary. They too deserve remembering, not because their lives were extraordinary, but precisely because they were not, because they represent the vast majority of human existence throughout history. The countless millions who worked and struggled and survived without ever becoming the subjects of historical narrative. They built the world we inherited. These anonymous workers built it with their hands and their backs and their endurance. And if we forget them entirely, we forget something essential about what it means to be human. So, tonight, as you drift toward sleep, carry with you, perhaps, a small appreciation for what once was, for the ice houses that held winter beneath summer lawns, for the workers who captured cold and preserved it through months of darkness and silence. Think of them when you open your freezer, when you drop ice cubes into a glass, when you take for granted the refrigeration that surrounds modern life with such completeness that we rarely pause to consider it. The cold that comes so easily to us came hard to them, cost them labor and pain and sometimes health, connected them through chains of cause and effect to pleasures they would never share. The ice houses are gone now, most of them, or exist only as historical monuments, but the human effort they represent remains worthy of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of the quiet respect we owe to those who came before us and made possible the world we inhabit. Let these images settle into your consciousness as the night deepens around you. The frozen pond in January darkness, the workers with their saws and tongs, the ice house waiting to receive its cargo, the long months of preservation, the silver bowl at the summer table, the worlds that touched and never knew each other, all of it fading now into history, into the past that recedes further with each passing year, into the silence that eventually claims every human story, but not quite forgotten, not entirely lost, carried forward in these words, in your listening, in the small act of attention that honors those whose attention was consumed by the hard work of survival. Thank you for joining this quiet journey into a forgotten corner of English history. If these late-night passages into the past bring you comfort or curiosity or simply companionship on sleepless nights, consider subscribing so that future stories might find you as well. Rest well wherever you are, whatever time your clock shows, and may your dreams carry you gently through the night until morning arrives with its easy abundance of warmth and cold alike. The miracles we no longer recognize because they have become so ordinary. Spring will come, as it always does. The ice will melt, as it always has. And life will continue, carrying forward what deserves to be remembered and letting go of what cannot be held. Sleep now. Tomorrow will arrive soon enough, bringing its own demands and its own possibilities. For now, there is only rest and the fading images of workers on frozen ponds, and the quiet satisfaction of having spent a little time in the company of the past.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe and leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be as peaceful as a calm sea beneath a patient, turning light. Share.